The road to Delamere Forest felt longer than it should have been, as if the distance stretched with every passing mile, pulling Daniel deeper into a place he could not yet understand. The sky above was pale and empty, covered by a dull gray that seemed to press down on the earth. His car moved slowly along the narrow road, tires crunching over loose gravel, the sound sharp in the silence. There were no other vehicles, no signs of life, not even birds crossing the sky. It was as though the world outside had been left behind without warning. Daniel had read about Delamere before coming here. Old stories, scattered reports, strange accounts that never made full sense. People spoke of a feeling, not a sight. A presence that stayed just beyond the edge of vision. He had dismissed most of it as exaggeration, the kind of tales that grow over time. But now, as the forest began to appear in the distance, those thoughts felt weaker. The trees stood tall and still, their dark shapes forming a thick wall that blocked everything beyond. He slowed the car as he approached the entrance. A wooden sign stood at the side of the road, worn and slightly tilted. The words Delamere Forest were faded, almost difficult to read. For a moment, Daniel considered turning back. There was no clear reason for the hesitation, only a quiet sense that something was not right. Then, without fully understanding why, he stepped out of the car, and the silence grew deeper. The air felt different the moment Daniel stepped beyond the edge of the road. It was colder, but not in a natural way. The chill seemed to settle beneath his skin, spreading slowly as he moved forward. Behind him, the car stood alone, already feeling distant, as though it no longer belonged to him. Ahead, the forest waited in silence, its shadows stretching deeper than the eye could follow. The ground beneath his feet was soft, covered with damp leaves that made no sound as he walked. That was the first thing he noticed. Even his own footsteps seemed to disappear the moment they happened. It was as if the forest absorbed every noise, leaving nothing behind. He paused, listening carefully, expecting at least the faint rustle of wind or distant movement. But there was nothing. Not even the sound of his own breath felt real. Daniel took out his phone, checking the signal without much hope. There was none. The screen felt strangely dim, even at full brightness. He turned it off and slipped it back into his pocket, a quiet unease beginning to form in his chest. He told himself it was normal. Remote place, weak connection, nothing unusual. But the feeling did not leave. As he moved further in, the trees grew closer together. Their branches twisted overhead, blocking what little light remained from the sky. Shadows formed in unnatural shapes, stretching across the ground in ways that did not match the trees. For a brief moment, Daniel thought he saw something shift between them. A shape, low and quick. He stopped instantly, and the forest seemed to notice. Daniel remained still, his eyes fixed on the space between the trees where he thought he had seen movement. The shape was gone now, if it had ever been there at all. Yet something felt wrong. The silence had changed. It was no longer empty, it felt aware, like something unseen had turned its attention toward him. He forced himself to breathe slowly, trying to steady the growing tension in his chest. "It's nothing," he whispered, though his voice sounded distant, almost swallowed the moment it left his lips. The sound did not travel. It simply faded, as if the forest refused to carry it any further. He took another step forward, then another. Each movement felt heavier than before, as though the ground resisted him in subtle ways. The trees around him seemed taller now, their trunks stretching upward into darkness that never lifted. He glanced back toward the direction he had come from, expecting to see a clear path leading out. But the entrance was no longer visible. Only more trees stood behind him, identical and endless. A cold unease settled deep inside him. Daniel turned slowly, scanning his surroundings. Every direction looked the same. The same shadows, the same stillness, the same unnatural quiet pressing in from all sides. He reached into his pocket again, pulling out his phone. Okay, hoping the screen might offer some sense of direction. But before he could unlock it off, a K sound broke through the silence. Soft, close. Not behind him, not ahead, but somewhere. Watching, the sound came again, clearer this time. A faint crunch. Like something stepping slowly over dry leaves, but Daniel knew the ground around him was damp. The noise did not belong here. It was out of place, subtle, yet deliberate. He turned sharply toward it, his eyes scanning the darkness between the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing appeared. Only shadows, unmoving and thick. "Hello," he called out, his voice low and uncertain. No answer followed. But the silence that returned felt heavier than before. Daniel stood there for a moment, his body tense, waiting for something else to happen. His mind searched for logic, another person, an animal, anything that could explain the sound. Yet deep inside, a quiet thought began to form. One he tried to ignore. He was not alone. The feeling grew stronger as he moved forward again, though every instinct told him to stop. Something pulled him deeper into the forest, not physically, but in a way he could not resist. Curiosity mixed with unease, guiding his steps despite the warning rising in his chest. The air thickened as he went further in. Breathing felt slightly harder now, as though the forest itself pressed inward. The light had dimmed even more, leaving the world around him covered in layers of shadow. Shapes seemed to shift at the edge of his vision, but every time he looked directly, there was nothing there. Then he noticed something strange. Marks on the ground. Not footprints, but something else, and they were leading deeper inside. Daniel crouched. Slowly, his eyes fixed on the strange marks etched into the damp ground. They were not random. Each line looked placed with intention, forming rough patterns that almost felt like symbols. He reached out, hesitating for a brief second before touching one. The soil was cold, far colder than it should have been. He pulled his hand back quickly, a sharp chill running through his fingers. The marks continued ahead, spaced evenly, leading between the trees like a silent trail. He followed them with his eyes, trying to see where they ended. But they disappeared into deeper darkness, swallowed by the forest before he could trace their path. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. His voice felt weaker now. As he stood up, a faint smell reached him. Damp wood mixed with something else, something old. It reminded him of a place long forgotten, untouched for years. The scent grew stronger as he stepped forward, almost guiding him the same way the markings did. The forest around him seemed tighter now. The trees leaned inward, their branches twisting together above, forming a thick cover that blocked nearly all light. The air barely moved. Even the fog hung still, unmoving and heavy. Then, without warning, the marks on the ground stopped. Daniel froze, right in front of him. The trail ended abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. There were no signs of struggle, no continuation, nothing to explain it, just empty ground. And a sudden feeling that whatever left those marks was no longer ahead of him, but somewhere much closer. Daniel did not move. The feeling came slowly, like a shadow, forming behind his thoughts. It was not a sound, not a sight, but something deeper. A quiet certainty that he was no longer searching the forest. Something in the forest had found him. His breath grew shallow as he stood there, staring at the empty ground where the markings had ended. The silence pressed closer, tightening around him like an unseen weight. He wanted to turn around, to run, to leave this place behind, but his body refused. It was as if the forest itself held him in place. Waiting, then a shift, not in front of him. Behind, Daniel's eyes widened, but he did not turn immediately. Every instinct told him not to. A deep fear settled in his chest, one that felt older than reason. Slowly, carefully, he began to move his head. Just enough to glance over his shoulder at first. He saw nothing, only darkness between the trees. Then a shape tall, still watching it, stood at a distance, partially hidden behind a thick trunk. Its form did not seem right. Too narrow, too quiet. As if it did not belong to the world around it. Daniel tried to focus, to understand what he was seeing, but the moment his eyes locked onto it, the shape shifted, not stepping, not running, just gone. The space it had occupied was empty again, but the feeling remained. Stronger. Now, closer. And no matter where Daniel looked, he knew one thing for certain. He was being watched. Daniel forced himself to move. Even though every step felt wrong, like he was walking deeper into something that had already decided his fate. His eyes scanning the endless trees as he tried to keep control of his breathing. But the forest no longer felt like a place made of wood and earth. It felt alive in a way he could not explain. Aware of his presence, aware of his fear, and slowly closing around him without making a sound. The image of that tall shadow lingered in his mind, repeating itself with every step until he could no longer tell if it had truly disappeared or if it was simply staying just out of sight. Following without needing to be seen, and then it began. So faint at first that he almost ignored it. "Hey!" Whisper, soft and distant, carried through the still air. Not shaped like words, but close enough to feel intentional. Like something trying to speak without being understood, Daniel stopped again, his body stiff as the sound brushed past him. Circling rather than coming from one direction, slipping between the trees, moving around him in slow, careful patterns. He turned his head, trying to catch it, but it always shifted just beyond reach, never loud enough to follow, never quiet enough to ignore. And as the whisper grew slightly clearer, it began to feel closer. Not in distance, but in presence. Like it was no longer traveling through the forest, but existing within it, within the space around him, pressing against his ears without touching them. And that was when the thought struck him, sudden and cold. That whatever was making that sound was not trying to guide him. Not trying to warn him, but studying him, learning the rhythm of his fear, and waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The whispers did not stop. They grew steadier, more deliberate, circling Daniel as though they were mapping him piece by piece, his steps slowing without his consent while the sound slipped closer, brushing past his ears in uneven patterns that almost formed meaning but never fully became words. And with every second that passed, the silence between those whispers felt heavier, like pauses filled with something unseen, something listening back. Daniel pressed his hands against his temples for a moment, trying to block it out, but the sound was not outside anymore. It felt internal, woven into the space around his thoughts, rising and falling in a rhythm that did not belong to him. And then the forest shifted again, not in a way he could see, but in a way he could feel. The ground beneath him no longer soft, but strangely firm, as if he had stepped onto something worn by time. He looked down slowly, his vision adjusting to the darkness until faint outlines began to appear. A narrow path, barely visible, stretching ahead in a straight line. Its surface different from the rest of the forest floor, smoother, almost deliberate, as though it had been used many times before. Yet there were no footprints, no signs of recent passage, only the quiet certainty that it existed for a purpose. And without realizing it, Daniel began to follow it, his feet moving in slow, careful steps while the whispers softened. Not fading, but changing, becoming quieter, almost satisfied. As if guiding him was no longer necessary, as if they already knew where he would go, and somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the thick darkness, something waited at the end of that path, something that did not need to call him anymore, because it understood that he was already coming. The path stretched forward without end. Thin and unnatural, cutting through the forest like something placed rather than formed. And Daniel followed it without fully understanding why. His steps slow but certain, as though turning away was no longer an option. The whispers now reduced to faint echoes that lingered at the edge of his hearing, no longer guiding him, no longer circling, only present in a distant, quiet way that felt far more unsettling than before. Because it meant something had changed. Something had decided it no longer needed to hide its intentions. The trees on either side grew darker as he moved, their shapes less defined, almost blending into one another until the forest itself began to feel like a single, endless wall closing in from both sides. And the air became colder with each step, heavy and still, pressing against his chest in a way that made every breath feel shallow. And then, without warning, the path began to widen slightly, opening into a small clearing that should not have existed in a place like this. The ground there was bare, stripped of leaves, smooth and untouched, and at its center stood something that immediately stopped him in his tracks. A structure, tall and narrow, made of dark wood or something that only looked like wood, its surface uneven and aged, rising from the ground like it had been there for far longer than the forest itself. Daniel stared at it, unable to move, his mind searching for reason, for logic, but finding none. And as he stood there, frozen between fear and curiosity, the silence returned completely, deeper than anything he had felt before, not empty, but filled with a presence so strong it felt almost visible. And in that moment, without a single sound to confirm it, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. This place was not abandoned, it had never been empty. And whatever had been watching him from the shadows was now waiting for him to come. Closer, Daniel stood at the edge of the clearing, unable to step forward, his eyes locked on the tall structure rising from the bare ground. Its shape uneven and wrong in a way he could not explain, as if it had been built without understanding what it was meant to be. The wood-like surface darkened with age, or something far worse, marked with lines that did not resemble carvings, but rather scratches made in haste. Desperate and repeated over time, the silence around him now complete again, heavier than before, pressing against his ears until even his thoughts felt muted. And yet the structure itself seemed louder in a different sense. Not through sound, but through presence, like it was aware of him standing there, studying him just as he studied it. Daniel slowly took a step forward, then another, each movement feeling disconnected from his will, as if something behind his thoughts was gently pushing him closer. The ground beneath his feet remained smooth and unnatural. No leaves, no soil patterns, just emptiness shaped into a perfect circle around the object, and as he moved nearer, details began to emerge that made his chest tighten. Faint marks along its base, irregular and layered, like countless attempts to communicate something that never fully formed into meaning. And in the center of the structure, barely visible at first, was an opening, narrow and vertical. Too thin to feel welcoming, too precise to feel natural. And from within that darkness, Daniel had the sudden and undeniable feeling that something was not only inside it, but had been waiting there long before he ever arrived. Daniel stopped just a few steps away from the structure, his body tense as if the air itself had become heavier near it. The narrow opening in its center now clearer, darker than anything he had seen in the forest so far, a void that seemed to swallow even the faint light that reached it. And as he stared into it, a strange pressure built behind his eyes, like the opening was not just being seen, but was also seeing back, studying him in a quiet, patient way. The scratches along the surface now appearing more deliberate the longer he looked, forming patterns that almost resembled warnings, but never settled into anything readable. And then something changed in the silence. Not a sound, but a shift. a subtle distortion in the stillness that made Daniel's skin tighten. The kind of feeling that came when something moved too close without being noticed. He took a slow breath and stepped slightly to the side, trying to understand the shape of the structure from another angle. But no matter where he stood, it always felt the same, like it was oriented toward him, aware of his position, adjusting in ways he could not prove but could definitely feel. And then from inside the opening, the darkness seemed to deepen further, becoming denser than the forest around. And in that moment, Daniel realized something terrifying. The structure was not empty. It was not waiting. It was occupied by something that did not need to move to be present. Something that had already noticed him the moment he entered the forest, and now that he was here, standing in front of its doorway, it no longer needed to hide its attention. Daniel should have run. Every part of his mind screamed at him to turn away from the structure and never look back. Yet his body refused to obey, as if something inside the clearing had quietly taken control of the space between his thoughts and his actions. He found himself leaning slightly toward the narrow opening, not walking, not stepping, but drawn in. A slow, unbearable pull that felt both physical and unreal. The darkness inside the structure no longer simply empty, but layered, almost textured, like depth without distance. And the longer he stared, the more it felt like the darkness was becoming familiar, as if it recognized him in return. A faint vibration passed through the ground beneath his feet, subtle but steady, like a heartbeat buried deep underground, and with it came a change in the air, a shift so slight it almost felt imagined. But Daniel knew it was real because everything in him tightened at once. The forest behind him no longer felt like escape, only continuation. And the structure in front of him no longer felt like an object, but a threshold. Something that separated what he had been from what he was about to become, and then, without sound or movement, the opening revealed something that was not light, but absence. A deeper layer of darkness that did not behave like shadow, but like intent. And in that moment, Daniel understood the worst truth he had faced since entering Delamere Forest. He had not been searching for the structure. The structure had been waiting for him to find it, and now that he had arrived, there was no longer any difference between curiosity and surrender. Daniel stood at the edge of the void, his breathing uneven as the structure seemed to grow quieter around him, not in relief, but in expectation. As if the entire forest had narrowed its attention to this single moment. The opening in front of him no longer felt like a physical space, but like a decision that had already been made long before he arrived, and yet his mind still fought for control, searching for reasons, for escape, for anything that could bring him back to the road where his car still waited in a world that now felt impossibly far away. The silence pressed in again, deeper than before, stripping away even the faint sense of wind that once moved through the trees. And in that absolute stillness, Daniel began to notice something new. A faint reflection inside the darkness, not of himself exactly, but of something shaped like him, standing in the same position but slightly delayed, as if the void was replaying his presence a fraction of a second behind reality. His chest tightened as he tried to step back, but his feet did not respond the way they should have. Instead, holding him in place with a strange heaviness that felt less like force and more like acceptance. And then the whisper returned, not from the forest this time, not from behind or around him, but from inside the structure itself, soft and close, speaking without language but carrying a meaning that settled directly into his thoughts. Not his words, but his understanding. And that understanding was simple and final. He was not standing in front of something unknown anymore. He was standing in front of something that already knew everything about him, every step, every fear, every reason he thought he had for coming here. And it had been waiting not to reveal itself, but to see what he would do when he finally realized he was never the one in control. Daniel's mind began to fracture under the stillness. Not in loud panic, but in slow realization. Like pieces of understanding falling into place one after another, each one heavier than the last. The reflection inside the void remained, but now it no longer copied him exactly. It hesitated. It shifted slightly out of sync, as if deciding its own version of him, and that difference made his stomach tighten with a fear he could not name. The air around the structure felt tighter now, not pressing from outside, but pulling inward. Like the world itself was folding toward that narrow opening. Daniel tried to speak again, but his voice did not form properly. The sound dissolving before it left his mouth, swallowed by the same silence that had followed him since the road. And then something subtle happened inside the darkness. The reflection stepped forward, just slightly, just enough to break the illusion that it was only a mirror, and in that moment Daniel understood it was not copying him at all. It was learning him, studying the way he stood, the way fear shaped his posture, the way hesitation lived in his smallest movements, and as he watched, the structure behind him seemed to respond. The scratches along its surface faintly shifting in perception, as though they were not marks at all, but records, endless attempts of something trying to reach out from inside and failing again and again. And now, Daniel was standing where all of those attempts had pointed, and the whisper returned once more. Closer than breath, not asking him to enter, not forcing him to stay, but simply confirming what he already knew deep down. That the boundary between outside and inside had already collapsed the moment he looked into it, and whatever stood beyond. The darkness was no longer waiting for him to step forward, because in some way he still could not fully understand. He had already been inside for a very long time. Daniel finally understood that the forest was never the main thing. Not the trees, not the silence, not even the structure itself. It was something deeper that used all of it like layers of skin hiding what truly lived beneath. And now those layers were gone. Stripped away by his own arrival, the reflection inside. The void no longer hesitated. It stood fully formed now, matching his shape, but carrying something wrong in the smallest details. The posture slightly too still, the presence slightly too aware. As if it had spent longer being Daniel than Daniel ever had. And the realization struck him with a cold clarity that froze his thoughts. Whatever was inside the structure was not reaching out to him. It was finishing something that had already begun before he ever stepped onto the road. The whispers returned one last time, not as sound, but as certainty, filling the space inside his mind until there was no room left for doubt. And the forest outside the structure felt distant now, like a memory he was slowly being separated from. The darkness inside the opening deepened again, but this time it did not feel like emptiness. It felt like arrival, like recognition, like something finally closing after being open for far too long. Daniel tried to step back, but the movement did not complete the way it should have, his body responding slower. Not resisting, just fading in priority, as if the world no longer needed him to remain fully present. And the final thing he saw was not a monster, not a face, not a figure, but the reflection stepping forward just enough to overlap his own. And in that instant, there was no struggle, no sound, no escape, only the quiet acceptance of something that had always been watching through him rather than at him. And then even that thought disappeared as the darkness of Delamere Forest finally stopped observing him, because there was nothing left that was separate enough to be seen.